Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
When asked to speak about the economics of unsustainability, one has a problem, which is that actually this is a major area of economic analysis. If you want to see the scale of it, I suggest that you read all 600 pages of the Stern Review. That would really give you a complete conspectus of the field. So what I've decided to do today, I'm just going to focus on one particular issue, which is very important to economists, but which, in my experience, non-economists do not understand and do not take. And so the issue then is, should we discount the future? Now let me begin by just saying, as far as environmental unsustainability is concerned, there are basically two key processes that you have to know about. Now the first one really reflects the biological resources, and here I'm thinking about fish, forests, animals. Those things which, in a sense, breed or reproduce, and so we harvest the reproduction in each period. And there is a problem that over time we have tended to harvest those things to destruction or extinction. So we fish out the seas, we chop down forests much too fast, and so on. And the question is, well, why do we do that? What is the reason for that? And the clue is this business about over time. The other major area, and this of course is the area of global warming and so on, is that of external effects in production, pollution, CO2 emissions. And the whole point here is that those over time generate cumulative costs to others, even globally. And I think it's very important to get this idea of external effects. What do I mean by an external effect? It's something which I do, either in production or in consumption, where I don't pay the full costs of what I'm doing. So let me just give you a very brief example. You are driving your car down the motorway, except if you're green, you shouldn't be driving a car at all right? But you're driving your car down the motorway, and it begins to get a bit crowded. Everybody begins to go slower. Now, the point which you need to realise is, it can be shown that by adding your car to all those other cars, you slow down not only yourself, but everybody else on the motorway at that point. You are creating an external effect by slowing everybody else down. They use more fuel and so on. Now, this is a very important effect. And so when I talk about pollution, CO2 emissions, what I'm saying is the things we do have impacts on many more people than just ourselves. Now let's get to the really difficult bit, which is discounting. Discounting the future, what does it mean? Well, the first bit of the argument is very, very simple, and everybody understands this. If you have 100 quid, your great aunt Agatha gives you £100. You can put it in your building society account, and in a year's time you'll have £105 at a 5% interest rate. Everybody understands that. Now, let me ask you what you would do if Aunt Agatha said to you, I'm not going to give it to you now, I'm going to give you £100 in a year's time. Now, you might say, well, Aunt Agatha, that's very generous of you, and please don't die between now and then. But you might argue like this. You might say to yourself, well, if it's a promise I can rely on, getting £100 in a year's time, how much is it worth to me now? And the answer is, it's worth to me now the sum of money which, if I invested it at 5%, would give me exactly £100 in a year's time. I trust even after lunch, that is true. And that's what we mean by discounting the future. So in the example I've got on the screen, if Aunt Agatha gives me £100 in a year's time, it's worth 95.25 pence to me now, plus or minus a little bit, if the interest rate is 5%. That means future values, when they're brought back to the present, in an economy which has interest rates, are worth much less than they are at the point at which they're going to be received. So let me now just show you a set of values. So this is across the top. It's saying how much is it worth receiving, let's say, £1, 25 years hence, 50 years hence, 100 years hence. And down the left-hand side are various interest rates. Well, clearly, if the interest rate is 0, then when you discount, it doesn't really matter. All right? If the discount rate gets a bit higher, let's go to 1%. £1 received in 25 years is worth 0.78 pence now. Because if I had...
78 pence.
Sorry, 78 pence. Yeah, 78 pence. Because if I had 78 pence now and I invested it over 25 years at 1%, it would give me £1. All right? We come right down to the bottom. If somebody promises a 6% interest rate, somebody promises you £1 in 100 years, it's worth absolutely nothing. All right? So that's what discounting the future is all about. Now, why does it matter? Why does it matter? What are the implications? Well, the implications are really quite interesting. And the first thing I've talked about is just something very kind of common, which we know about. Let's suppose there is a 3% discount rate. Let me go back to the thing above. All right, 3% discount rate, that's the bottom, not the bottom line, the penultimate line. What you'll see is in 25 years' time, by a pound 25 years' time, it's worth 0.48 pence now, 0.23, and so on. Okay? Right. Now, there's something very peculiar about this, because if we have an economy with an interest rate in it, what it's actually telling us is that as consumers, something which we're going to receive in, say, 25 years' time, let's say as part of our pension, is only worth 0.48 pence now. And that's slightly odd. Equally, if firms are going to receive £1 in profits in 25 years' time, that's only worth 0.48 pence now.
48 pence.
Sorry. I'm an economist. So what is the magnitude? Thank you. That's very good. Now, the question is, well, why do we do that? And part of the reason, I think, is what one might call is, from the point of view of consumers, is simply myopia. When you get to my age, of course, you may not think about 25 years hence, because I might not actually be here. So maybe I'm right to discount what may be my income in 25 years' time. From the point of view of firms, the reason they do it is simply because they know that technologies and markets change over time. So if something is going to give you some money in profit in 25 years' time, you more or less discount it, because everything may have changed by then. Let's move to a second example, because I can see your eyes glazing over. Let's go to biological resources. Let's suppose that there is a fish stock which is reproducing at the rate of 3% per annum. Okay. Question: if the interest rate is 6%, what do? Well, the rational thing to do, economic rationality says, you fish it out. Why? Because you take all the fish out of the sea now, you collect the money from selling the stock, and then you can invest in the 6%. If you leave the stock in the sea, it'll only grow at 3%. So economic rationality tells you, use it up now. All right, that's the thing to do. Let's take the example of climate change. Let's suppose that we can identify a cost arising from climate change, which will be £1 million in 50 years' time. Okay, there's a cost, some particular cost. Let's say a bit of flooding is going to occur in 50 years' time. The present value at 0.5% is 780k, but at 3%, it's only worth 230k. All right? So that future cost now is only worth 230k. So, if I'm going to invest 250k now to prevent that cost, it's only worth it if the interest rate is a bit less than 3%. I'll leave you to ponder on that. That's it. All right. Let me take a rather different case, which is the cost of carbon. I mean, many people have said what we really ought to be doing is we ought to be charging people the cost of carbon, because carbon accumulates in the atmosphere, and so we should be charging people the full cost of their emissions now. And so what you do is you say, if you add an extra ton of carbon to the atmosphere, you can work out, along with everybody else's tons of carbon, what over a period of time the costs are going to be, discount it back to the present, and you should charge people for the external costs that they're actually imposing not on us, on the current generation, but on all future generations. Now, the point about this then is that, of course, if you're discounting at a low rate of interest, the cost of carbon is going to be very high. If you're discounting at a very high rate of interest, the current cost of carbon will be very low. So it's very important that we know what discount rate we should use. There is actually another twist to that, which is quite interesting. If you discount at a very low rate, then you're attaching values, higher values, to things which are occurring a long way into the future. All right? We're attaching values, things that are occurring a long, long way into the future. But of course, those things, by their very nature, are much less certain. So if you have a very low discount rate, you may have a higher current cost of carbon, or you should be charging a higher, but you'll be much less certain about what the right value should be because you're uncertain about the true outcomes of doing this. Now, what value for the discount rate? Well, I like teasing economists, but there's a big disagreement. It's a very, very big disagreement. And I don't think this is generally understood, how big this disagreement is. If you read the Stern Review suggests that we should use a discount rate of 2.2% for the current century, 1.4% long term. The leading economist of climate change in the States, William Nordhaus, says 6% is more appropriate. Now, those are very big differences. If you go back to my discounting table, that makes a huge difference as to what you think the costs of the global warming are going to be. And so the question is, well, why is there a disagreement? And what I find is that an awful lot of people out there don't understand why this isn't just a technical issue. In other words, why can't the economists work it out? It seems odd, you know. Why should they, one very eminent economist say it ought to be 1.4% for long term, and another very eminent economist say, no, it should be 6%. And why can't these characters disagree? Well, of course, it's the old joke about, you know, if you have 3 economists in the room, you'll have 4 opinions, and you know, a huge amount of disagreement. But I think people don't understand why this isn't a technical issue. And so what I really want to do is to explain to you why it's not a technical issue. There are 2 ways of looking at this. One way of looking at it is to say, well, let's do it from first principles. Let's try and work out from first principles what rate we think we ought to discount in the future. The alternative view, which is established largely by Nordhaus in the States, is why don't we use market rates? You know, we have markets, we have market rates, why don't we use those? So let's ask the question, how much should we discount the future? And this underlies certainly the Stern Review. We'll leave the first bullet point and let's just push on. In the Stern Review, if you read the technical bits, and I'm not suggesting you should, if you read the technical bits, basically they say there are 2 reasons for discounting the future. The first reason is what's called the pure rate of time discount, and the second is that future generations are getting wealthier. So let's deal with the first one, the pure rate of time discount. This is simply saying, just because something occurs in the future, we ought to discount it. Now, the question is, well, why on earth should we do that? Well, there's one reason which I think is disreputable, and there's one reason which has a certain sense to it. The first one is just what economists delightfully call impatience. We want it now, not later. Right? And so there's a sense that we're impatient to consume or whatever it is. Now, I mean, morally, I think that's pretty objectionable. The second reason, which is not entirely unrealistic, is what I call the non-zero risk of destruction of the Earth, or the hazard rate. So if you think that there is only a 99.9% probability that the Earth will survive for another year, and I could be talking about a meteorite, or I could be talking about some catastrophic thing which human beings do to themselves, but if you think there's only a 99.9% possibility that we'll just keep going, and that's the hazard rate from year to year, then what you find is that there is a reason then for discounting the future, because there's a possibility that in 50 years' time we won't be here. And indeed, I haven't got the number yet. I think if it's a hazard rate of 0.1%, yes, I have got it here. In 50 years, there's only a 95% probability it'll still be here, and in 100 years, there's only a 91% probability it will be here. So you might say there is some kind of reason for a pure end-time discount. Now, the second reason is this business about future generations getting wealthier. And here it's just simply, human experience has been that succeeding generations are better off than we are. So why on earth should we hold back, all right, just to provide for our exceptionally rich great-great-great-great-grandchildren? That's the argument. It's more technical. The next question then, or the alternative view, is say, well, why don't you use market rates? Why don't you use market rates of interest? And the great advantage of that is that it reflects the actual preferences of current consumers. Right? That reflects actually what people say they want. But it has a huge defect, and that is that your great-great-grandchildren don't have a voice in current capital financial markets. Right? They're not there to say what they would like. So, in a sense, they're relying on our goodwill in writing our last wills and testaments so as to provide enough for them going forward. And that's an interesting issue. I think their interests need to be protected. There's a second reason, which certainly that Swede goes on about quite a lot. I'm referring, of course, to Mr. Lomborg. But it's a respectable argument. And the argument is this. It says, if you have a very low discount rate for climate change, then what that means is that you're going to invest in climate change mitigation, which will give you rates of return which are less than you could get on other desirable investment projects. And the one they'll always bring up is they'll say, do you know that the rate of return to human capital formation in poor countries, the rate of return is something like 7 to 8%. So do you really want to invest in climate change activities, climate change reduction, where you're talking about discount rates which might be as low as 1%? Isn't there something wrong with that? And so the argument would be, and this is the Nordhaus line, he would say, yes, we need to take climate change seriously, but not yet. All right? We have to wait, and in the meantime, let's put money into other things so that by the time it gets critical, we'll actually have higher incomes, particularly in poor countries, and they'll be better able to cope. The third problem about using market rates is simply nobody can agree what the market rate is. And this is actually a serious issue because the market rate on risky investments in the United States has been, until the stock market collapsed, between 6 and 7%. On a risk-free investment, it was 1%. Now, that is, in the economics literature, a huge puzzle. Nobody actually can quite explain why that happened. But it does make a huge difference whether you say climate change, let's say, investments are competing with what the stock market reflects, or whether they're competing with riskless investments of one kind or another. Now, all of that is working within the basis that we do discount the future. What I want to suggest is actually that maybe there are other ways of doing this. And the first thing, and I think this is a very interesting idea, is that maybe we should think about not discounting the future, but insuring the future. Let me put the point to you like this. I suspect that most of you have house insurance, right, against fire. So, right, most of you have got a house insurance against fire. Occasional brave soul doesn't, but most people do. What would you do if suddenly house insurance was no longer available? Well, I suspect what you would do is, although in fact the risk of your house being burnt down is very, very low indeed, all right, what you would do is you would invest yourself in things to reduce fire risk. So you put in more fire alarms, you might put in sprinkler systems, you'd make sure that you had things which were not flammable in your house. You would take action to do something. Now, as I read the IPCC report, you remember that sort of fan of possible options going forward. By the end of the century, the mean prediction is 2.8 degrees centigrade. But much more worryingly, there's a 15% probability that the increase in temperature will be 4.5 degrees centigrade. And there's a non-zero probability, 0.03, that it'll be greater than 6 degrees centigrade. 2.8, probably we can live with. As I understand it, 4.5 and definitely 6 we cannot live with. So it's a very low risk, but it's a low risk of an immensely serious outcome. And one of the arguments is that what we should be doing is ensuring our future by bringing the whole distribution of outcomes down, so you don't get these very high, low probabilities, these very high outcomes. The second possibility which we might need to consider is possibly we should decide that there are some things we shouldn't discount. So economists work on discounting commodities, but maybe we shouldn't discount the environment. Maybe we should say the environment is something we don't discount going into the future. And that's one way of doing it. Another way of looking at it is that the political theorists, or some political theorists, have got this idea of preserving human rights in the future, including rights not to suffer dangerous climate change. So the question is, just because somebody is going to live 100 years hence, do they have any less right than I have now to live in an environment which is not despoiled? Now, there is an argument which says, don't bother about it. You see what the argument would be? Why should we not bother about it? Well, of course, because we go on now, there won't be anybody in 100 years' time, so why should we bother about their rights? Okay? But that's not a particularly serious argument, I think. But I think what I would want to argue is that the discount rate for rights should be zero. So if we say that people in future have the right to an environment which is not hazardous in some way, then that's not something we should discount back to the present. I actually think that these kinds of discussions about discount rate, which start off looking very technical, but I'm beginning to open up and say, look, these are rather more things on which more people ought to have views. One of the things which, certainly as a Christian, I come to this and I say, well, is there anything from a Christian point of view, from the point of view of Christian moral reasoning, which will help me to, as it were, decide on some of these more technical arguments? And let me just run through various things. First of all, let me make it clear that up to this point, the line I've been taking has been entirely anthropocentric. Economists focus on human well-being, philosophers focus on human rights. A theocentric view would say nature belongs to God, the natural order belongs to God, and we have a delegated responsibility to care for it. So, it seems to me there may be very good reasons for taking the side of Stern against Nordhaus for supporting low discount rates. Equally, the collective insurance argument is compatible with the stewardship role for humanity. In other words, We can't insure the planet, but what we ought to be doing is investing in ways in which we can maintain that stewardship role over time. What about caring about the rights of future generations? Seems to me we could say, as Christians, that future generations are also to be responsible stewards. And it's not for us to take that away from them, just simply because of the way in which our economy works. And finally, just a little reminder. We're dealing here with fallen human nature, and we need policy interventions. I don't think the market is going to solve this problem. But remember, we need political authorities who are under God, whose role is to prevent evils and to promote the good.
Good. Questions, please. Thank you very much, Donald. Yes, please, a question there. And there's another one there in the middle. Have you got? Oh, you've only got one. Right?
Yes.
Sorry.
John Twyler. Something that means a lot to me, and I don't know if it comes into economics, is no regrets. Because, I mean, thinking of renewable energy, which I work in, what is wrong with using sunshine and wind? You've got new products, new technology, local jobs. What is wrong with growing your own food? It tastes better. So, no regrets, I think, is a very important thing in practice. It widens the whole scene, perhaps taking a lot of these things in, but says there are other things that should be taken into consideration that we enjoy and we like.
I thought maybe you were referring to there's a no regrets literature about, which is a bit like the argument I talked about ensuring the future, which says that you go for a situation where whatever the outcome, given the distribution of outcomes, you make sure that those outcomes which are really bad are excluded. You do things to stop that. Now that's one meaning of no regrets, but I don't think that's what you're talking about.
I'm sorry, I didn't know the other one.
No, I mean, my view is, whether we like it or not, we live in market economies. The market economy is dominant throughout the world. That's the world in which we live, so we better be realistic about it. So the question is, how can we actually change the way in which people view their consumption patterns? What are the things that they really want? And that seems to me really accords quite closely with what you're saying. In other words, that we've got to persuade people that there is a better way of living their lives. And I think that's what you're talking about.
Question here.
My name is Paul Austin. I have really an extension of that question, I think. To my mind, discounted the value of money in the future is a technicality, whereas to my mind the central issue in thinking about the effect, for example, of carbon on the environment is the fact that at the moment when we take a plane journey, the cost to the environment is not included in what we pay. And I think what needs to be done is to set up a proper framework whereby what we pay for everything we do takes full account of the impact upon the environment. If we have to accept that we live in a market economy, that there isn't any other rules for regulating what we do, then we must charge properly for everything we do, and that would be the first thing, to my mind, that we should tackle from an economic standpoint.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I don't agree with you about the discount rate, because the whole point about carbon, as I understand the science, is that it accumulates in the atmosphere. So once you put your carbon in there, it's there, and it's there, and it's there, and it's there. It accumulates. So what you've got to do, if you're going to charge for carbon, you have to charge not only for the current cost, but you have to charge for all the costs in future. And if you're then going to bring that back to a single price, you need a discount rate. And if it's a high discount rate, the cost of carbon will be low. If it's a low discount rate, the cost of carbon will be high.
Question behind you. No, sorry.
Mark Chalmers from Kiel. Going back to the title of the talk, the conference, the root causes of environmental unsustainability. I appreciate what you did to try and explain and be critical of conventional economics. But going back to a point that John Horton made earlier is the root cause is it's sin. Well, I'm really inclined to say that it's something more specific than that. It's vice, and neoclassical economics, market economics, promotes vice. It promotes greed and jealousy and lust. And there's a bank. There's a
Sorry, what's the question?
Okay.
But lots of people waiting.
There's a document from the World Bank which has a subtitle called The World Bank and Other Faiths, where all the world faiths basically say that market economics, utilitarian approaches to environmental problems are inappropriate. So would you be, basically economics doesn't work, isn't democratic for this issue?
Wow. I think I've wasted my life, probably. I sympathise with what you're saying. What I think I would say to you is, whether you like it or not, the world in which you live is a world which is in fact dominated by markets. Now, markets have some very good features and they have some very bad features. Right? What I would say to you is, what we need to do is to learn to use markets as our servants and not as our masters. All right? So I'm not in the business of saying abandon the market economy, is the wrong thing to do. What I'm trying to say to you is, let's do things within the market economy which can address the real issues, let's say about global warming or pollution or unsustainability or whatever it is. But I think we have to work with the grain of things rather than sort of saying, oh, we're going to abandon all that. Incidentally, I do agree with you about the utilitarian basis of economic analysis. Yeah.
A question from the other group, please.
No questions here.
No questions here. Okay. Question here, please.
Andrew Aston. Just to respond to your answer, it reminds me of the in Wilberforce's day when Christians and others were trying to argue for the abolition of the slave trade, and a lot of the anti-abolitionists were saying the sorts of things you just said. Well, let's go with the grain, let's go gradually, all sorts of arguments were put up that are being put up against taking radical steps towards changing our lifestyles to reduce climate change. So I'm not sure how to put that into question because it just came up as a response to what you just said.
I suppose I'm just old. If what you're saying is, should all of us live a radical lifestyle? The answer is undoubtedly yes. I have absolutely no hesitation about saying that. But if I'm faced with the possibility that there will be no world for our grandchildren to inhabit, and I have 5 grandchildren, so maybe our great-grandchildren inhabit, if I'm faced with that question, what I want to do is I want to have action now that is politically and economically feasible. And if we wait for everybody to become extremely radical about their lifestyles, I have a feeling it won't happen.
But Wilberforce achieved it. Or God achieved it through Wilberforce.
Your point is good.
Question over here, the lady with the white jacket. On the other side.
You've talked about carbon pricing, and we're seeing efforts to review the carbon market in the EU, the emissions trading system. I wondered how hopeful you are about economic solutions to these kinds of problems through international carbon trading arrangements in the future.
Well, that of course is the million-dollar question. I mean, it strikes me that the approach of the Stern review is the right one. And I say that not only because Nick Stern's a good mate of mine, but it does seem to me that what we have to do is we have to work backwards. We have to want to say, where do we want to, what sort of concentrations do we have to achieve? Then we have to work back to working out what the trajectory should be. And we then need to have, as it were, targets in each of those periods. The question then is, how do you implement those targets? And that is the question. And it's not easy to get international agreement on that. I entirely agree, and that would be the subject of a completely new lecture. But we have to try, don't we? We have to try. Otherwise, I think we just throw up our hands in horror and wait for the end.
Last question.
I just got just two comments about which you might like to say something. You say that we're sort of fixed in the market economy. We've got to sort of learn to live with it, and of course it has its side, and I'm not personally all that against it up to now. But don't you think that in fact it's sort of now in a state of auto-destruct, because it's a market economy that has, to a great extent, along with the inventions of science, caused the global warming and climate change crisis, which itself is going to upset the market, whatever you say about discounts in the future and so on. And the other point I wanted to make, which I find is generally rather depressing, everyone says, oh, how wonderful India and China and all the developing countries are becoming so much richer alongside of us, or even surpassing us. Shouldn't it be the case that we should be going for a less developed way of life? We should learn from the not so developed countries to lead a happy but not so consumerist and destructive way of life. I hope you've related his comment.
Well, I hope that I've already answered the second question, which is that I think, yes, all of us should be, as it were, living like that. And one of the things which I find most distressing about the Christian church in this country is it doesn't live like that. Its lifestyle looks just like everybody else's lifestyle. And I find that extremely distressing. But let's leave that on one side. On the other side, we live in a fallen world. What option have we got? Are we going to go to, command and control economies? Do you really want to, reconstruct the Soviet Union? And, it just strikes me we don't have alternative options at the moment. If you're being realistic going forward, you live in a world which is market dominated. And that's not going to change any time soon. And so you better learn to live within that world and do what you can within that world. That's the, if you like, the art of the possible, as Rand Butler once described it. And that's what we have to do, in my view.
Thank you very much.